The lockbox was nothing special, just a plain wooden box with a brass clasp, and my nephew Mark told me it was worthless junk as he pitched it into a cardboard box headed for the dump. I pulled it out of the trash 2 hours later and found a yellowed deposit slip inside, with my mother's handwriting trailing down the back edge. She had written 6 words that made my hands go cold. Mark is not your ally. Save yourself. 18 months later, I was sitting in a title company office, signing the deed to a commercial condo on Maple Avenue, the very building where my nephew once ran a $60,000 per month law practice. And he was standing at the bus stop across the street in a paralegal's cheap suit, waiting for a ride to the firm that now leased the space from me. I didn't plan any of this. I inherited the whole disaster the morning my mother died, when the vultures started circling before her body was even cold. My name is Claire Delaney. I was 58 years old when my mother passed, a retired bookkeeper living quietly on the north side of town, still wearing the same pearl earrings my husband John gave me on our 20th anniversary before pancreatic cancer took him in 2011. I never remarried. I poured myself into keeping his memory alive the only way I knew how, by using the $200,000 life insurance payout to put my orphaned nephew through law school and to help his young wife Vanessa with the down payment on their first house. Mark's parents, my brother and his wife, died in a car wreck when Mark was 16, and I took him in without a second thought. I packed his lunches, attended parent-teacher conferences, taught him how to balance a checkbook. When he got into law school, I co-signed the private loans, and when he graduated, I paid them off with John's insurance money because I believed in him. I thought I was investing in my own safety net. He promised me, standing in my kitchen with his diploma in his hand, that he would be my power of attorney when the time came, that I would never have to worry about old age because he would handle everything. One detail that becomes relevant later. I spent 30 years as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized construction firm, and that meant I knew how to read a general ledger, how to spot a cooked invoice, and how to open a locked filing cabinet with a tension wrench and a rake, because the office manager before me lost the keys to the cabinet that held the payroll records during an audit, and I taught myself out of necessity. That small, dusty skill set sat dormant for decades. It woke up like a watchdog the night I decided to stop being a victim. My mother, Alina, was 84 and sharp as a tack right up until a stroke dropped her in the produce aisle at Jensen's Market. She died at Sacred Heart Medical Center at 3:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. I was holding her hand, and in those final moments her fingers squeezed mine with a strange, urgent pressure, like she was trying to tell me something without words. By 5:30 that same day, Mark and Vanessa were in the hospital waiting room, and Mark was already talking about the estate. Not about his grandmother's favorite hymns for the service, not about the obituary wording, not about where I would sleep that night because I had just lost the last person who raised me. He was pacing the linoleum with his phone pressed to his ear, rattling off things like probate timeline, small estate affidavit, survivorship deed, while Vanessa stood by the window tapping on her tablet, her Hermes scarf perfectly knotted even though the temperature outside was 94 degrees. They embodied the phrase, image-obsessed, down to the pores. Vanessa, in particular, treated social standing like a second religion, and any hint of pro bono or family messiness was a sin to be scrubbed out of sight. Within 48 hours, they had descended on my mother's house with a clean-out crew that looked more like asset reviewers. Boxes of financial records, jewelry cases, even photo albums were sorted into piles labeled with sticky notes. Keep, sell, shred. I wandered through the living room like a ghost while they cataloged my childhood. The smell of my mother's lavender sachets still hung in the air, and every object they tossed into a bin felt like an erasure. That's when I saw the box. It was sitting on my mother's dresser, an unvarnished cedar box the size of a thick paperback, with a little brass clasp that had tarnished green at the edges. Mark picked it up, opened it, saw only a few old coins and a folded deposit slip, and said, "This is nothing, just junk," and dropped it into the cardboard box by the door marked for the landfill. I waited until they were both in the kitchen arguing with an estate appraiser over a Tiffany lamp. Then I slid the box into my purse, my heart slamming against my ribs. That night, alone in my mother's guest room with the door locked, I opened it properly. The coins were wheat pennies from the 1940s, nothing valuable. The deposit slip was from a bank account I didn't recognize, and on the reverse side, in my mother's steady cursive, she had written, "Claire, Mark is not your ally. He will take everything. Save yourself. The Bluebird remembers." My mother had called me Bluebird since I was a toddler because I used to sing early in the morning. No one else knew that. Underneath the words, she had written a 6-digit number, 041792, which I recognized as my father's birthday backward. I sat on the edge of the bed, reading the sentence over and over, and I felt the first faint tremor of something that was not grief. It was something closer to the quiet click of a breaker tripping in my chest. I pressed the deposit slip flat against my palm and knew, with a certainty that felt both monstrous and clarifying, that my mother had spent her last conscious days trying to warn me, and she had trusted me to be smart enough to listen. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the people who should protect you the most are the ones you need to protect yourself from. Now, back to what happened next. The manipulation started before the funeral flowers had wilted. Mark and Vanessa sat me down in my mother's living room with a folder of estate documents and a thick document titled Durable Power of Attorney for Finances. They used soft voices and repeated phrases like taking care of Auntie and reducing your burden, and we just want you to feel safe. The paperwork would grant Mark full legal authority over my bank accounts, my brokerage account with $180,000 from John's old retirement rollover, and my little house on Sycamore Street. He presented it as a formality, something every responsible family did. Vanessa squeezed my hand and said, "You've done so much for Mark, now let us do this for you." I looked from the papers to his face, and I saw the same face that used to ask me for lunch money, the same eyes that cried at his father's funeral, and I almost believed him. Then I remembered the deposit slip in my purse, the words my mother had scratched out in what I now realized was deliberate haste, and I felt a coldness settle over me like a second skin. I told them I was still foggy from the funeral, still grieving, and I asked for a week to think. I let my voice shake a little. I let my fingers tremble on the pen as I set it down. They smiled and agreed, but that evening, I found Vanessa photographing the titles to my car and my mother's property from a drawer in the study. She didn't hear me approach, and I watched her for a full 10 seconds, the camera flash illuminating her face in the dim hallway. I didn't confront her. I just filed the data point away and backed silently into the shadows. Over the next week, they escalated. Mark appeared with a real estate agent who just happened to be dropping by to give a valuation on my house. The agent walked through my living room with a laser measure, while Mark talked about upsizing potential and seller-friendly staging, and I stood in the kitchen gripping the counter so hard my knuckles went white. Vanessa suggested I move into their guest house, a converted pool cabana behind their McMansion in the Ridgemont subdivision, so they could keep an eye on me, and I wouldn't have to manage a big house alone. When I hesitated, they brought up my age, my loneliness, the fact that I had no children of my own, and how grateful I should be that my nephew was willing to step up. They used phrases like peace of mind and family first, and you've sacrificed so much, now it's our turn. I understood the play then. They wanted me isolated, dependent, and surrounded by their version of reality so they could extract everything without interference. So I did the opposite of what they expected. I played weak. I played foggy. I let my shoulders droop and my voice waver, and I signed nothing, not a single page, while saying things like, "I just need a little more time to think. I'm so tired." I moved into their cabana exactly as they wanted, because I knew I could learn more from inside the fortress than from the outside. I packed my mother's lockbox and my bookkeeping skills and my lockpick set, and I walked into the lion's den voluntarily. On the day I left my house, I stood in the doorway and looked back at the life I had built with John, the garden he planted, the porch swing where we drank coffee every summer morning, and I whispered a promise to that house that I would return, no matter what it took. The cabana was a converted garage with a kitchenette and a single bedroom, separated from the main house by a brick courtyard and a flimsy door with a push-button lock that jiggled in the frame. That suited me perfectly. It meant I could watch the main house, and they couldn't easily watch me. The first red flag came within 3 days. I was sitting on the patio at dusk when I heard Mark on the phone through the open window of his home office, his voice tight and frantic. He was saying things like, "The Bartlett deal is going to crater. We need to cover the margin call by Friday. And no, You cannot sell the Porsche yet because the title hasn't even been issued. I filed that away too, jotting down the phrase margin call on a notepad I kept hidden under my mattress. Then I started paying attention to the mail. I noticed bills from a Lexus dealership, the statement address showing a new car, finance charges piling up. I noticed a credit card statement addressed to me, to a card I had never opened, arriving at their house with a $12,000 balance mostly accumulated at high-end restaurants and a resort in Cabo San Lucas that Mark and Vanessa had visited 3 months earlier. I didn't open it then because I didn't want to tip them off, but I noted the account number and the issuing bank, and I mentally filed it under identity theft. The night I saw that statement, I lay awake in the cabana listening to the distant hum of their swimming pool pump and felt something shift inside me, a slow, steady hardening that felt almost like the early stages of an audit where you know the numbers are wrong but you haven't yet found the smoking gun. The next piece of the puzzle came from an accident that was not an accident. One afternoon, Vanessa tripped on the edge of the Persian rug in their foyer and sent a stack of manila folders flying across the marble floor. She was fine, but she scrambled to collect the papers before I could see them. I was faster than she expected. While she was picking up the insurance policies and the tax returns, I spotted a single page that had slid under the console table, a document titled Irrevocable Special Power of Attorney Limited to Brokerage Account 4829-0117, with what was supposed to be my signature at the bottom. I only saw it for 2 seconds before she snatched it away, but I saw enough. The signature was a clumsy tracing. The notary stamp was from a notary whose commission number, I would later verify, had expired 8 months before the date on the document. And the brokerage account number matched my account, the one at Wainwright Securities that held every dollar John and I ever saved. That was the moment the fog lifted completely, and I began to plan with the precision of a career auditor who had just spotted the discrepancy that would unravel the whole system. I walked back to the cabana, closed the door, and sat down at the tiny fold-out table I was using as a desk. I wrote down every detail I could remember, the account number, the notary ID, the date stamp, the approximate wording of the document. Then I drew a line down the center of the page and began building a timeline on one side and a list of evidence I needed on the other. Bookkeepers think in ledgers, and I was drafting the most important ledger of my life. That night I waited until the main house went dark and the sound of their television faded out. Then I gathered my tools, a small flashlight, a pair of thin nitrile gloves from under the kitchen sink, and the lockpick set I had tucked inside a tampon box at the bottom of my overnight bag. It was a simple kit. A tension wrench, a short hook, a Bogota rake, and a half diamond, all tucked into a leather roll smaller than a pack of gum. I had only ever used it on office filing cabinets, but that was exactly what I was dealing with now. Mark kept his home office locked when he wasn't inside, a flimsy interior door with a standard pin tumbler cylinder. I walked across the courtyard barefoot at 2:00 a.m., feeling the cold brick under my soles, and I slipped into the house through the laundry room door I had left unlatched after dinner. The security system had been disabled months ago because Vanessa kept setting it off by accident, a piece of negligence that I quietly appreciated. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant click of the ice maker. I knelt in front of the office door and worked the lock by feel, tension first, gentle pressure on the tension wrench to bind the first pin, then the rake, a gentle scrubbing motion while listening for the faint metallic click of each pin setting. I could feel the plug begin to rotate fractionally, and then the final pin gave way with a soft, definitive click, like a period at the end of a sentence. The whole process took less than 40 seconds. Inside, the office smelled of leather and stale coffee. I went straight for the filing cabinet behind the desk, the one I had seen Mark lock every evening. The cabinet was a 2-drawer Hahn model with a wafer lock, even easier than the door. I used the half-diamond pick to jiggle the wafers into place while applying light turning pressure, and the lock opened in 20 seconds. The top drawer held client files, leases, partnership agreements. The bottom drawer held a hanging folder marked Personal C.D. And that was my file, a thick wedge of forged documents and financial schematics. I took the entire folder to the desk lamp and began photographing every page with my phone, the flash disabled, holding my breath to steady my hands. There was the fraudulent, durable power of attorney I had glimpsed earlier. The signature, a clear copy-paste job with pixels visible at the edges when zoomed in on my phone. There was an account opening request for a joint checking account, a credit union in my name and Mark's name, dated 3 weeks before my mother died, along with a voided check bearing my routing and account numbers that I had never provided. There was a liquidation request form for my $180,000 brokerage account, with a transfer authorization to an offshore shell company registered in Nevis, an entity called Meridian Asset Holdings that I later traced through the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists database to a law firm associate of Mark's. There were credit card applications in my name with my social security number and a forged employer section listing fake income from a consulting company that didn't exist. And there, in a glossy folder, was the purchase order for a 2025 Porsche 911 Carrera S, metallic blue, with a total price of $143,000, financed through a lender that had used my brokerage account as an asset verification source. The sickening part was the date on the application. It was submitted 2 days before my mother died. They had been running this operation while she was still breathing, planning to empty my accounts the moment she was gone, and I was destabilized. I sat in that leather chair for over an hour, photographing every document, cross-referencing account numbers and misspelled names and notary stamps with suspended licenses, and then I carefully put everything back exactly as I found it, wiping the cabinet handle with my sleeve to remove any prints and resetting the lock with a slow reverse turn. The next morning, I found shredded documents in their recycling bin under a bag of coffee grounds. I waited until they left for a client lunch, and then I dumped the bin onto the kitchen table and began the painstaking work of reconstruction. Bookkeepers are patient by nature, and I can reassemble a shredded ledger faster than most people can do a crossword puzzle. I sorted the strips by color and edge pattern, then began taping them together with a roll of clear tape I found in a junk drawer. It took me 3 hours, but by the end, I had rebuilt 6 complete pages of wire transfer records. Those strips revealed a pattern of wire fraud, small amounts siphoned from elderly clients' trust accounts over 18 months, amounts ranging from $2,000 to $8,000 apiece, the kind of low-dollar, high-frequency theft that most grieving families never catch because the withdrawals look like routine disbursements. One of the reconstructed pages had a client name, Mrs. Lorraine Pettigrew, with a date of birth that placed her at 92. I stared at that name for a long time, thinking about a woman who probably trusted Mark just like I did, and I realized then that I was not just protecting myself. I was sitting on evidence that could put Mark in prison and expose a network of financial predators. I photographed every reconstructed page, then carefully discarded the evidence in a dumpster 3 blocks away to avoid raising suspicion. The dead man's switch presented itself 2 weeks later, and it was my mother's hand reaching up from the grave to save me. The numeric code she had written on the deposit slip, 041792, turned out to be the access PIN for a safe deposit box at First State Bank under my name and hers jointly. I drove to the bank alone on a weekday morning, my hands steady on the steering wheel despite the flutter in my stomach. The bank lobby smelled of floor wax and old paper, and the safe deposit vault had that heavy, cool air that feels like a library of secrets. I presented my identification, signed the access log, and the clerk led me to a private booth where I slid the metal box onto the table and lifted the lid. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead from Wainwright Securities, dated 18 months prior, that outlined an unusual protective measure my mother had established on our joint brokerage account. The account had been structured with what the bank called a dual lock provision, a bespoke arrangement requiring 3 simultaneous conditions to liquidate or transfer any amount exceeding $5,000, a notarized wet signature from both account holders, a medallion signature guarantee from a certified bank officer, and the physical presence of a named compliance liaison, a woman named Harriet Clemens who worked in the fraud prevention division of Wainwright's downtown office. My mother had established the measure after a data breach in her senior living community, and she had updated it 6 months before her death to specifically designate me as the sole surviving account holder with irrevocable control, meaning that once she passed, the lock shifted entirely to my consent. The note attached to the letter, in her handwriting, said simply, "They can't touch this without you, Bluebird. Use it wisely." I sat in the safe deposit room and wept for 10 solid minutes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing my mother had seen the storm coming and built me a bunker, and she had made sure I held the only key. The ally came into focus that same afternoon. The bank manager contacted Harriet Clemens at my request, and within an hour I was sitting across from her in a conference room with a view of the river. Harriet was a compact woman in her 60s with silver glasses and a voice like gravel in a cement mixer. She listened to every word I said without interrupting, her pen tapping a slow rhythm against her legal pad. Then she opened a case file on her laptop and showed me something extraordinary. Mark had already attempted to access the brokerage account 6 days after my mother's funeral. He had called the bank's customer service line pretending to be me, using my social security number and my mother's maiden name as a verification answer, and he had requested a wire transfer of $175,000 to the same Nevis shell company. The bank's biometric voice authentication system had flagged the call because the voice profile did not match mine, and Harriet's team had frozen the account pending a fraud review. They were building a case for the FBI, and they needed my cooperation to confirm the forgeries and to plant a final piece of bait that would trigger a federal arrest. I agreed without a second thought. Harriet slid a small USB device across the table, a device that looked like an ordinary lipstick, but was actually a data extraction tool designed to clone the hard drive of Mark's office computer. All I had to do was plug it into the back of his desktop tower for 30 seconds. I told her I could do that in my sleep, and I meant it. That night I waited until Mark and Vanessa went out for a dinner reservation, walked into the house through the laundry room, plugged the device into the USB port on the back of his desktop while the screensaver glowed, and watched the tiny LED light blink steadily as it copied every file, every email, every deleted document fragment. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes, but I did it, pocketed the device, and left via the courtyard without a trace. I delivered it to Harriet the next morning in a paper bag from a coffee shop, and she confirmed the data included direct communications about the shell company and the forgery plan. The maximum cruelty beat came on a Thursday, and it stripped away any last shred of family loyalty I had been clinging to. I decided to test them, to see with my own eyes what they would do if they thought I was dying. I had already installed a tiny nanny camera in the lintel of the cabana door, one of those devices that looks like a phone charger and transmits to a cloud server. I positioned the camera to capture a wide angle of the hallway and kitchen. At 10:00 a.m., when I knew they were both home and the house was quiet, I walked into the main house through the courtyard and made my way to the kitchen island. I stood there for a moment, listening to the distant sound of Fox News from the living room, and then I collapsed. I crumpled onto the tile floor like a bag of bones, one hand clutching my chest, my breathing shallow and rapid. I made sure I was clearly visible from the hallway. Mark walked past me about 30 seconds later, holding a thick folder from his office, the one with my forged documents. He looked down at my body, my pale face, my outstretched hand, and he stepped over my legs without breaking stride, his eyes on the document in his hands as if I were an obstacle to be navigated. Vanessa appeared behind him, glanced at me with a flicker of annoyance, and said one word in a flat voice. Dramatic. Then she followed Mark into the study and closed the door. I lay there for 4 minutes, stone cold sober and heart rate steady at 72, listening to them argue about an upcoming mediation hearing, their voices rising and falling with irritation about deadlines and judge assignments. Not once did either of them look back. Eventually I got up, walked back to the cabana, and checked the camera feed. The footage showed exactly what I described, and I sent it to Harriet that night with the subject line, Exhibit A, adding a note that said, "This is who they are." I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched that clip 3 times, and each time I felt less like a person and more like a machine that had finally been calibrated to do what needed to be done. The confrontation was a masterpiece of misdirection. 2 days later, Mark and Vanessa announced that we were going to the bank to update the signature cards because of some new compliance rules. In truth, they had arranged for a corrupt mobile notary to meet us in the bank's private client lounge, a man named Keith who had already notarized 2 of the forged documents in the folder, and they planned to force my signature on a full power of attorney and a liquidation request that would sweep the brokerage account clean in one transaction, all while I was physically present and supposedly compliant. They drove me to the First State Bank downtown in the Porsche that hadn't yet been seized, Vanessa in the passenger seat with her sunglasses pushed up like a shield, Mark driving with his jaw set like a man on a mission. The leather seat smelled new and expensive, and the engine purred with a low, menacing smoothness that felt like the soundtrack to my own undoing. I sat in the back clutching a tote bag with my evidence folder inside, the deposit slip from my mother tucked into the front pocket where I could feel the edge of it against my fingers. When we entered the bank, Harriet was waiting at the reception desk in a gray suit, her expression calm and professional. She guided us to a private conference room, and the notary, Keith, was already seated at the table with a leather portfolio and a notary stamp, his face a mask of bland officiousness. The documents were in front of him, spread like a buffet. The durable power of attorney, the account transfer authorization, a medallion signature guarantee blank, all waiting for my signature. Mark handed me a pen with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Just sign where the sticky arrows are, Aunt Claire. I'll explain the rest later." I picked up the pen, held it, and set it down again with a soft click that was louder in that quiet room than any shout. I looked at Mark's face, at the fine lines around his mouth that I had watched form over decades of Christmases and birthday dinners, and I said very quietly, "You can't steal from me with my own name. I didn't sign any of these, and now you've just signed your own indictment." Mark's face went through 3 shades of color in rapid sequence, confusion, then panic, then a deep, ugly rage that I had never seen before but had sensed was always there. He reached for the documents, his hand shooting out like a viper, but the conference room door opened and 2 FBI agents walked in with Harriet and a uniformed bank security officer. The agent in the lead, a woman with a tight ponytail and a sidearm, placed her hand on the folder and said, "Mr. Delaney, we have warrants for your arrest on charges of elder financial exploitation, wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and money laundering. Place your hands on the table." Vanessa started shrieking about lawyers and defamation, her composure cracking into a high-pitched string of threats, but the second agent was already reading her rights with a steady monotone. The notary, Keith, tried to slip out the side door and found himself greeted by a third agent, his notary stamp clattering to the floor like a confession. The whole operation took less than 4 minutes. The dual lock provision on my account worked exactly as designed. Because I was physically present and refusing to sign, and because Harriet was there as the named compliance officer, no single document could authorize any transfer. The account remained frozen in my name alone, and the attempted fraud was captured on the bank's internal cameras and documented in the agent's simultaneous report. As they handcuffed Mark and led him out, he looked back at me with an expression I still can't fully describe, part fury, part disbelief, as if he genuinely could not understand how the woman who packed his lunches had become his undoing. The aftermath unfolded in layers, each one a small, deliberate victory. Mark's law practice collapsed within a month. The state bar suspended his license pending investigation, and the firm he had built on a foundation of stolen client funds and forged documents was seized by a court-appointed receiver. I retained a probate litigation attorney, a sharp woman named Sandra Okonkwo, who specialized in breach of fiduciary duty cases, and we filed a civil suit that moved through the courts with surprising speed because the criminal evidence was so overwhelming. I learned probate litigation not in a classroom, but in Sandra's conference room, sitting across from her with a legal pad and a highlighter, asking questions until I understood every nuance of durable power of attorney statutes, constructive trust remedies, and the rules of evidence for forensic document examination. Forgery was proven beyond any doubt by a certified handwriting analyst who testified that the signatures on the fraudulent documents were traced from a birthday card I had signed for Mark 10 years earlier. The analyst showed the jury how the pen pressure was uniform, the stroke order unnatural, and the telltale pixelation from a low-resolution scan was visible under magnification. The notary stamps were invalid, the account numbers mismatched, and the notary, Keith, cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge, his testimony walking the courtroom through every step of the scheme with a kind of exhausted relief. The judgment came down on a rainy Tuesday. We were awarded $280,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, treble damages on the conversion counts, and attorney's fees. Mark's assets were liquidated to satisfy the judgment, including the practice's real estate, a commercial condo on Maple Avenue that he had purchased with an SBA loan co-signed by his now-estranged partners. I bought that condo at the receiver's auction for $260,000, using a cashier's check from the judgment proceeds. The building was a 2-story brick structure with a glass-walled reception area and a parking lot with exactly 22 spaces. The law firm that had employed Mark's former associates, a mid-sized general practice called Betrayal and Cross, had been renting the second floor of the building from Mark's entity. When I became the owner, I offered them a long-term lease at market rate, with one condition written into the addendum. Lesser shall be engaged as a retained expert witness in all elder fraud and fiduciary abuse cases filed against or involving Mark Delaney or his associates, at standard rate to be invoiced separately. The managing partner read the clause, looked at me over his glasses, and said, "Mrs. Delaney, that is the most satisfying writer I've ever initialed." Mark, stripped of his license and disbarred, ended up working as a paralegal for Betrayal and Cross, a position he got only because his former colleagues pitied his wife and their mounting debts. He now prepares document review summaries in the same building where he once signed partnership agreements, and at least twice a month I am retained to testify in a case where he is the subject. I walk into the conference room with my file binder and my forensic accounting report. I sit across from him at the deposition table, and I explain to the jury exactly how he forged the power of attorney, how he replicated the notary stamp, how he manipulated vulnerable clients into signing away their homes. The look on his face never changes. It's the same blank, calculated indifference he wore when he stepped over my body on that kitchen floor. But I am not the woman on the floor anymore. I am the expert. I am the one who studied the rules of probate litigation until I could recite the elements of fraud in my sleep. I am the one who leases him his desk. My brokerage account was restored in full by Wainwright's fraud insurance, plus interest and fees. The $180,000 that was supposed to be my quiet retirement cushion is now intact and growing in a conservatively managed portfolio that Harriet's office monitors quarterly. Because some habits never die, and a little paranoia is a healthy accessory when you've been betrayed by your own blood. The $200,000 from John's life insurance, the gift I gave to Mark for his education, is legally irrelevant but morally the deepest cut. I had to accept that no civil judgment can unwind a gift that was given freely, even under false promises. What I got instead was something more permanent. I got the title to the building. I got my voice. I got to watch a man who thought he was untouchable ride the bus to a job where he is not allowed to speak in court. My mother's lockbox sits on my dresser now, the same one I pulled from the trash. The deposit slip is framed in a small shadow box next to it. Every now and then I look at those 6 words, and I think about how much fear and love and foresight it took for an 84-year-old woman to write them down in secret, knowing she might not be alive to see them matter. She trusted her instincts. She trusted me to be smarter than I looked. And she left a mechanism, not a weapon, a tiny procedural tripwire that relied on nothing more complicated than a mother's nickname and a banker's diligence. That is the quiet architecture of real protection. It's not built on revenge or violence or dramatic confrontation. It's built on the slow, patient work of noticing, documenting, and refusing to look away. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. And if you found value in this story, please hit like and subscribe, because there are more stories where this came from, and more quiet architects out there who need to know they're not alone. Stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next one.